All right. So let's start with a basic question. When you hear the word personality, what comes to mind? What comes to mind for you?
The way you are.
The way you are. Okay. Uh, that's part of it, sure. Anyone have another understanding of what personality is?
Character,
Say it again.
character,
Character, right? Yeah, for sure. I see something in the chat.
Traits that people display.
Traits that people display, how you are or act as a person. Okay. That's an interesting one because while we're going to talk about personality in humans, researchers have found different animals have distinct personalities as well. So it's interesting. But let's get a working definition. So if you were going to say, well, what is personality? It's basically your characteristic pattern of thinking, feeling, and acting. If I were to say it, it's what makes you unique, right? Now, if you're looking for the word itself and the root of the root of the word is persona. Now, persona uh, means mask, but you're probably thinking from a Western point of view. Well, what does a mask do, right? So, a mask from a Western point of view covers your face, hides who you are. But if you were to go to Latin countries or the theater, the mask that people wore was not meant to be a disguise, but rather it was meant to be their character as a whole. It was meant to be who they were. It was meant to be their essence. And if you go and see wrestlers, their costumes are part of their character. It's not designed to be hiding who they are, right? So there are a lot of places where you can see the mask becomes who you are, not hides who you are. All right. So let's take a historical perspective. There are two really early foundational theories as it relates to personality that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk from a psychoanalytic perspective and a humanistic perspective. And then we'll talk about some more modern understandings. Now, if I'm going to be fair, trait theory originates earlier than some of these humanistic principles, but that it's still considered modern because of it's continuing to evolve. And then we have this social cognitive theory, right? So we'll get into it. Now, if you're going to say, well, what do each of these lenses focus on? Well, from a psychoanalytic perspective, the focus is on the unconscious, psychosexual development, and so forth, and how these factors impact who you are. From a humanistic perspective, the focus is on growth, reaching one's potential, self-actualization, and so forth, right? So it's interesting. If I were to say, well, where do you start? Where do you end, right? The goal of a psychoanalytic model is to try and understand, what makes people neurotic, and from a therapeutic point of view, uh, try and help them go from neurotic to quote unquote normal. Whereas a humanistic point of view, oftentimes referred to as a third force psychology, your baseline is normal, and the goal is to go from normal to reaching your potential. So the lenses are different. Um, it's interesting, and by the way, when I teach personality theory, I go much further in depth. Each of these perspectives has a whole chapter you could talk about. And there are 4 other perspectives that aren't even on the slide, but I'll leave that for when you take personality theory. Now, traits. When we talk about trait theory, so these are dimensions of personality. These are typical patterns, relatively stable patterns. So that's a trait. So when we think about your character, this is part of your essence and it's relatively stable. And you're probably wondering, well, why am I saying that? Because I want to make a distinction between the concept of traits and states. A trait is pretty stable, right? Whereas a state tends to be transient. And I'll give you an example. Let's say a person by nature was pretty easygoing and happy. So we would say that their character or part of their character is that they are a happy person. Does that mean that they're going to be happy all day, every day? The answer is no, right? So if they lose a loved one, they're going to go through a period of sadness. And even though they're by nature a happy person, for a window of time, they're not going to be themselves. They're going to be in a state of sadness. And as they work through the grief and loss, then they will revert back to their nature, right? So traits tend to be relatively stable. States tend to be more transient. So that's kind of why I said what I did. And then the 4th model that we're going to look at is a social cognitive perspective, which is trying to understand how people behave in relation to the environment, right? You might hear this referred to as a person situation interactionist theory, right? So if you take personality theory, you might hear it that way. And this lens starts to look outside of the person, say, hey, hang on. I know we said that people tend to be, generally speaking, pretty predictable and they have a pretty stable sense of personality, but the environment or the social context matters too. And that's going to affect how we behave. So
Yeah.
we'll go through each of these perspectives. A little bit of history, though, right? We're going to go into psychoanalysis first, right? Because Freud is the father of psychoanalysis. But what I'm doing with this brief history before we go into it is to show that, like I said in an earlier lesson, being the founder of an idea is not the same thing as being an originator of an idea. So when we talk about, I'm going to have to mute you. I was getting feedback. Being the founder of an idea is not the same thing as being an originator of an idea. And what I'm doing when I talk about antecedents are things that came before psychoanalysis. And some of the ideas that Freud discussed were well established even before his day. So let's look at Leibniz, right? So when we think of Leibniz, Leibniz is considered one of the co-founders of calculus. So you probably have heard that name before. But for our sake, for our purpose, we focus on his philosophy, right? And what he says was he believed in this concept called monadology. And monads were these non-physical particles or psychical particles that add to your perception. It's kind of like a an atom of the mind, if you could think of atoms and how things are constructed. But these monads come together and they become part of your perceptual experience. So that monadology and these bits of pieces that come together for perception or a conscious experience, that's part of Leibniz's theory. He also acknowledged that there are levels of consciousness, right? So not everything that we experience are we directly aware of, right? So we have our conscious experience, and then there are things that happen outside of our conscious awareness. And Herbart elaborated on this idea of levels of consciousness, and he talked about this concept of subliminal experience. Now, Lyman, if we we're going to break the word subliminal up, a Lyman is a threshold. And a threshold in this context is a threshold between your conscious experience and things that are happening outside of your conscious experience. So subliminal are the things that are happening beneath the surface. So we're having this experience that we're not even aware we're having sometimes. Things are working beneath the surface. And Herbart explained that the things that get put beneath the surface are oftentimes the ideas that are not compatible with our conscious experience. We're going to see that Freud would say it's those taboo ideas that get put beneath the surface. So that's our understanding of the unconscious, right? So these are the things that are happening outside of our conscious awareness. There could be subliminal experiences, and oftentimes the things that we're looking at in the unconscious are incompatible with our conscious thought. All right. Now, Gustav Fechner. Now, Fechner was a physiologist, but he also added a lot to philosophy and added a lot to psychology as well. But Fechner used the analogy that the mind is like an iceberg. And similar to an iceberg where you don't see the vast majority of it, you see the tip of the iceberg. You don't see the whole thing. So too with the mind, the vast majority of who we are and our personality is beneath the surface, right? So that's Fechner. Now, Mesmer and Charcot, these were individuals who were working to help cure or treat people with some kind of physical or psychological illness. And we're going to see that Freud is the father of psychoanalysis, but he was influenced by these two people, right? So Mesmer, if you've ever heard the word mesmerize or to be mesmerized, well, that actually comes from this gentleman's name. And he worked with the wealthy people of the day. And what he would do is he would have these sessions where he would have people cured by passing magnets over them, right? So some form of magnotherapy. And it was a big to-do, and people would pass out, and there would be all these theatrics around him curing people with magnets. Well, one day he forgot his magnets, and he did his demonstration without the magnets, and by passing his hands over the people he was working with, and they got better. So Mesmer came to the conclusion that he had healing hands more than it was the magnets. Ultimately, Mesmer was discovered to be a fraud, right? And he was run out of town, and he set up shop in other places, and then, he bounced around a bit. But the idea of trying to heal people through magnets, Freud tried some of this. It didn't work. Charcot and Breuer. Charcot and Breuer are individuals who worked with hypnosis as a means of treating people. And they noticed that if you use hypnosis, you can access aspects of one's experience that they're blocking. Remember how we talked about subliminal experiences? So hypnosis was meant to put you in this relaxed trance-like state, which would reduce your filter or your the more reserved side of you, so that you could speak more freely. And Charcot used hypnosis. Now, hypnosis, that's great, but when Freud tried to use hypnosis, he discovered that it didn't work consistently. And the pattern was that people who were more suggestible, who were more gullible or more, believing things at face value, hypnosis worked better for than others. So this whole idea of magnotherapy, not an effective treatment. Hypnosis, inconsistent treatment. So Freud is trying to find a way, and he capitalized on all these individuals to get to the unconscious. Now, you may not think of Darwin this way, but we talked about Darwin in a concept of evolution and theories, right? Darwin has a very good theory, the theory of evolution. But imagine you probably don't think of Darwin in terms of dreams and dream analysis, right? But Darwin wrote a book on dreams, and he felt that there was something important about dreams, and it was telling you something, right? He also talked about the concept of catharsis, which is the through intervention, this release of emotional tension. So all of these individuals, I want you to hold on to their names and what they contributed, because we're about to talk about Freud. And when we look at Freud, you're going to say, oh, that sounds a little bit familiar. Oh, yeah, I remember that concept. So let's talk about Sigmund Freud. Freud believed that we're born with some basic drives and instincts. Now, originally, he believed in eros, right? Which was the basic life instinct that pushes us towards self-preservation. And that was the only life force. So think of eros or erotica, life, there's something to be said about that. Where Thanatos, right, was, if you look at the Marvel movie Thanos, right, it's a death instinct, right? Now, Freud didn't start with believing that we had a basic drive towards death as well. It was World War I that changed his perspective on things. And he came to the realization that just like humanity has a capacity to build and work towards life, we also have this darker side of us that is geared towards death and destruction. So these two forces are within inside of us. Now, in general, we usually focus on self-preservation. Now, what is the force or energy that pushes us towards self-preservation? It's our libido. Now, I'm defining libido very broadly as this psychical energy that pushes us towards our life instincts. Now, if you heard libido in the past prior to this class, you probably are connecting libido with sex drive, but it makes sense, and that is an appropriate use of the word libido, right? Because one of the purposes of sex is for procreation, to keep our species alive, right? On a more broader sense. But So it isn't just a sex drive. Now, Freud would have focused on the sexual component, but other psychoanalysts give this more broad understanding that it's a psychical energy as a whole. All right. So now we also spend some time trying to manage conflict, right? So when we think of managing conflict, we have these drives or parts of our personality pulling us in one direction or another, right? So some things are going to pull us towards our more base nature. Basic pleasures and drives. And then there's the other side of us that's pulling us towards the social conventions or what society says is right or wrong. Now, I'm going to explain that personality has three parts. I've only mentioned two of them so far. But if you've ever seen a cartoon where there's an angel on one shoulder and a devil on the other shoulder, and they're battling it out to influence your decision making, Freud felt that the mind was a battlefield like that, and we had to have a way to reconcile our basic pleasure and what society asks of us. So we'll come back to that. Now, levels of consciousness. Freud believed that the mind was like an iceberg, mostly hidden. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? Right? Because Fechner said that earlier. He also acknowledges that there are three levels of consciousness, right? So there's the conscious, there's the preconscious, and then there's the unconscious. The conscious refers to the aspects of our experience, or if we're talking about the iceberg, what's above the surface. So that's what we're completely aware of. The preconscious is kind of like the water level, right? Or right below the water level. And that's outside of our direct awareness, but accessible. We oftentimes say that the preconscious serves as a bridge between the unconscious and the conscious. It's what allows things from the unconscious to pop up into your conscious experience. And then the unconscious were these thoughts, feelings, desires that we're not aware of, that are oftentimes taboo. So we push it beneath the surface because when we're thinking fantasies or taboos that don't fit in what society thinks is right, it's uncomfortable. So we push it out of our conscious thought. And similar to that iceberg analogy that we said with Fechner as well, the larger portion of the iceberg happens beneath the surface. So get this. So if the vast majority of personality is happening beneath the surface in this unconscious realm, Freud felt that that's the part of personality we should be studying. Freud felt that that's where the essence of personality was. So how do we tap into the unconscious, right? So we have to have ways to bring things from out of our conscious awareness and bring it up to the surface. So Freud tries many different things, right? So we talked about hypnosis. He tried hypnosis as a way of trying to bring things from the unconscious to the conscious. And as I said earlier, he was disappointed because it was not consistent, right? So some people responded well to hypnosis, other people did not respond as well to hypnosis. So that was an important point. So he's like, well, if I need to tap into the unconscious, I'm going to try things that are more stable. Now, he also tried dream interpretation. And I'm going to talk about dream interpretation out of order from free association, and you'll see why. But dream interpretation is he felt that one of the ways we process things in the unconscious is through our dreams. And during our dreams, that allows us to explore some of these taboos, some of these forbidden wishes or desires. So we process it. And Freud felt that we have the manifest content and the latent content. The manifest content was what you actually dreamt. So he wrote down all of his dreams, what they were, and then he looked for the symbolism behind the dream. So we'll talk about some of his symbols, but he felt that there were things in the dream that would cue you into the deeper unconscious desire or fantasy that you're exploring. So in fact, you might hear the phrase from Freud, dreams are the royal road to the unconscious. But his dream analysis turned out to be incorrect, and he over sexualized it. So when we're working to try and understand the unconscious, there are people who don't do dream analysis, or if they do dream analysis, they do it in a very different way than Freud suggested. But the belief that dream analysis has any impact, that comes from Darwin, right? So we're starting to see a lot of these ideas are being recycled, right? And then he comes to this idea called the talking cure, right? So say whatever comes to mind and we'll sift through it. And when there is something that is seemingly relevant, we'll explore it further. So free association, we're encouraging the client to say whatever's on their mind, and then we dig deeper. Now, this becomes the essence of psychotherapy. This becomes the essence of talk therapy. It starts with Freud. So while I said to you in our first lecture that Freud was not the founder of psychology as a whole, he was the founder of psychotherapy as we know it today. And there are different models of psychotherapy, but at its core, we owe Freud a tremendous debt of gratitude for psychotherapy purposes. So let's talk about these dreams, right? I said dreams are the royal road to the unconscious. And what you're looking at are on the left side are the symbols in the dream, right? The actual content or manifest content. And then on the right, you see the latent content, right? So the latent content is what it really means, the hidden meaning of the symbol. So I took this from a book on the history of psychology. I thought it did a pretty good job. So if you dreamt of a house, that could be a person's body. And depending on the kind of house it was, it would be a male body or a female body. And it makes sense what he says. It's not true objectively, but the rationale makes sense. So if you had a smooth fronted house, flat, he described that as the male body. Whereas if you had a house with balconies or ledges, there are protrusions, and similar to the female breast, he suggested that that was the female body, right? So dreaming of a house could be a person's body. Dreaming of children was symbolic of one's genitals. Dreaming of playing with children was a fantasy of masturbation, according to Freud. Now, in the movies, you're probably more familiar with the symbols that suggest male and female genitalia. So from Freud's point of view, elongated structures like trains or umbrellas or the Washington Monument were symbolic of male genitals or a penis. and enclosed spaces or receptacles, boxes, ovens, closets, tunnels were female genitals. And it's interesting, if you look at old film, you could see psychology in film. They were not as explicit with sexual acts. They would show maybe two people taking their shoes off, then they would sit in bed, and then you would have a scene cut, and that scene cut would show a train going through a tunnel. Now, that train going through a tunnel was symbolic of sexual intercourse, right? So, because you have an elongated structure, symbolic of the penis, some enclosed space like a tunnel, symbolic of the vagina, and the train going through the tunnel. That's how they alluded to sexual intercourse. So it's pretty interesting, to say the least. Has anyone seen any old film that referenced it that way? Anyone have a reaction to that? Okay, fair enough. So I encourage you to look at old film. Now we have the act of or physical expression of affection is pretty much broadcasted on film, but there was a time where film was a little more modest. Now, if you dream of bathing, that's similar to birth. Think of the amniotic fluid the baby's in. So there are a lot of these interesting ideas. But one of the criticisms of Freud is that anytime he inserted sex to his theory, he overdid it. He was over the top. And we see that with dream analysis. Now, I said to you, most people don't do dream analysis in therapy today. However, if a person does do dream analysis, they're not going based on Freud's handbook of symbols. Instead of the therapist being the expert, you become the expert of your own dream. And that makes sense, right? So if you had the dream, who am I to tell you, okay, well, this is what the dream meant, right? You know the context a little more. So, when it comes up in therapy, if a client asks me, I had this weird dream, I could say, okay, tell me about it. And after they tell me about the dream, I don't say, okay, well, my interpretation is XYZ. I throw it back to them and say, well, why do you think that is you had that dream? What could it possibly mean for you, right? These kind of questions allow the person to be the expert of their own reality, right? So even if we do dream analysis, it doesn't look anything like what's on the previous slide in this one. Okay. So another core piece of Freud's theory is this belief in the tripartite theory of personality. Tripartite. Tri, anytime you hear tri, it's three, like triangle, three-sided shape. Tricycle, three-wheeler, right? So tripartite is three parts, right? So a tripartite theory of personality, Freud believed that there are three aspects of personality at play. And you had the id, ego, and superego. The id, by nature, is considered amoral. Now, some books will say immoral, but Freud didn't really come to the decision of morality. He said it's amoral. It lacks morality. It doesn't make decisions based on morality. So what does the id govern itself with or focus on? Sex and aggression. So the focus of our basic drives are sex and aggression. So the id is seeking pleasure, operates based on the pleasure principle, and it wants instant gratification, right? So It isn't looking to defer pleasure. It isn't calculating right or wrong. It's just deciding I want it and I want it now, right? So that kind of mindset. So it doesn't use logic. It's very primary primitive drives, and it's not in touch with reality. So it's just our basic pleasures. On the other side, we have the super ego, right? So we said Freud said that the mind is a battlefield, right, between these forces. The superego is the exact opposite of the id, and it is the part of our personality that reflects our ideals, our standards for judgment. It's our moral conscience. So if you were to think of Jiminy Cricket uh, would suggest as an outside super ego for Pinocchio, right? So that was let your conscience be your guide. Remember that phrase? Now, the id and the superego are diametrically opposed, right? Because um, the superego operates based on moral ideals. So it's more idealistic. It seeks what's right and wrong based on what society says. Um, and it's our basic morality. So you have a part of you that's seeking instant gratification. You have another part of you that's seeking to defer gratification. You have a part of you that focuses purely on pleasure. And in opposition, there's this part of you that's seeking on what's right and wrong. And they're in conflict at all times. So we need a peacekeeper. We need a mediator, right? So the third force is our ego. Now, when you hear the word ego, you probably think of arrogance, right? But in this context, it's not what we're talking about. We're talking about this is your part of personality that's very pragmatic, very practical, operates based on the reality principle. So what the ego has a couple functions. One, and I'm going to say it a couple times because I want it to click, and you should write it down. One of the primary jobs of the ego is to balance the desires of the id without compromising the values of the superego. So you want to satisfy the desires of the id without compromising the values of the superego. So does that make sense? So we have to be a mediator. We have to find some compromise between the two. Another function of the ego is to help us cope with stress, right? And or distress or anxiety. And we're going to talk about the concept of defense mechanisms shortly. But let me make this really practical. Let's imagine you were a 6-year-old kid and you walk into the corner store, your local store, and you see a candy bar and you want it. What does the id say? What does the id say? Take it. There's a candy bar. You want it? Take it. Does the id care whether it's illegal to steal or immoral to steal? No. The id says, just take it. It's there. You want it. Take it. The superego would say, hey, wait a minute. You can't steal. Stealing is wrong, right? If you steal, you're going to get in trouble. Your parents are going to be upset. The shopkeeper is going to be upset. You might get punished by the law. And from a religious and or spiritual point of view, it's against a moral code. So the id says just take it. The superego says don't take it. And you have, like I said, that cartoon, take it, don't take it, take it, don't take it, take it, don't take it. And you have these two forces, not literally, but symbolically on your shoulders in one ear and in the other ear trying to tell you to do opposite things. Now, if you were pulled in opposite directions at all times, you could lose your mind, right? So constantly being torn or pulled in opposite directions. So we have to have a way to reconcile this. So what does the ego say in this scenario? Okay, I hear you, super ego. He can't just take it because that's stealing. I hear you, id. I know you want this candy bar, but let's find a practical way to get it. So the ego, to reconcile the two, might say, hey, why don't you ask your parents if you can have some money to buy it? This way, the id, which wants the candy bar, gets the candy bar. And the superego, which doesn't want you to steal, is satisfied with the fact that you're not stealing. So you go home. You ask, hey, can I get a couple dollars to buy a candy bar? Your parents say no. Sorry, with the holidays, it was very expensive month, and we're still paying down the debt. So we can't give you a couple dollars at the moment. So you're upset. The id is upset. The id is like, I still want that candy bar. The superego is like, well, you still can't steal it. It's stealing is wrong. And then ego says, hey, why don't you look through the couch cushions, see if change fell into the couch. You search the couch cushions and you find a few pennies and maybe a couple quarters, but not enough for the candy bar. What's the id going to say? I still want that candy bar, right? Because it's about instant gratification. It's about pleasure, and candy bars taste good. The superego is like, well, you still can't steal. Stealing is still wrong. I know we've tried these things, but stealing is still wrong. So the ego says, why don't you ask the shop owner if you can unpack a couple boxes? And obviously, you're not going to work for the shop owner forever, but it's a way of saying, instead of taking the candy bar, I'll work for it. And say to the shop owner, can I unpack a couple boxes? And all I'm asking is for this candy bar in return. And then the shopkeeper says yes. At that point, all three parts of the personality are satisfied. The id, that basic primal side of you that wants pleasure, is satisfied because it got the candy bar. The superego is satisfied because you didn't steal. And the ego is satisfied because it's a crisis averted, crisis reconciled. So you see how these three parts of personality work together. Now, if we were to look at this iceberg analogy, right, keeping the concepts we said of Fechner and Freud, they both said the mind is like an iceberg, mostly hidden. So if you look at, if this were your personality, only the tip of the iceberg shows. So this is your conscious experience. This water level is kind of your pre-conscious. You see how it gets murky. And then the vast majority of your personality is beneath the surface. Now, this picture tells you some other things as well. If you were to look at the id, The id, those basic desires and fantasies, are entirely beneath the surface, right? So if you want to know where your taboos are, your fantasies, they happen in the id, the more primal side of you, and it happens in the unconscious. Now, I said just because it's in the unconscious doesn't mean it's not going to affect you. Of course, it's going to affect you, right? So um, these drives are going to pull at you, and you're going to feel a need to go in a direction. But now you see you have your ego and your super ego. They go across all three levels. What's interesting as well is the sheer size of the id. It's the largest force. So if instead of viewing the mind as an iceberg, let's go back to the other thing I said. The mind is a battlefield. If the id has this much of a land region, the country is that large, and its army is that large, why doesn't it just overtake the superego and the ego, right? It's bigger than the two combined. Well, the answer is that the id is also more primitive. Remember, it's more basic. So if we had armies and the id was fighting with sticks and stones, and then the superego and ego are fighting with machine guns, even though you have more a larger army, a larger land base, you're not going to win that battle. So the ego and the superego tend to be a little more sophisticated. Okay. The next piece of Freud's model is his theory of psychosexual development. Now, I said to you that every time Freud inserts sex into his ideas, he tends to get it wrong. There are a lot of ideas that Freud got right. Levels of consciousness. Well, neuroscience has established talk therapy and free association. I said he's pretty much the founder of modern psychotherapy. We're going to talk about defense mechanisms shortly. So there's a lot that he said that was correct, but every time he added sex into his theory, he made a mistake, right? So, but of course he's going to make that mistake because he felt that one of our basic instincts was linked to sex and aggression, whereas two thoughts of our primary forces. So let's talk about his psychosexual stage theory of development. Freud believed that in childhood, the pleasures of the id move from one erogenous zone to another. And based on where you are, there are different things that happen. So let's talk about it. The first stage is the oral stage. So according to Freud, pleasure surrounds the mouth, right? So if we were to think from birth to about 18 months, that kind of makes sense, right? Because if we were to think of one of the primary sources of pleasure is food. And how does a baby get food? It could be breastfeeding or bottle feeding. So these feeding experiences, the baby derives pleasure. But here's the thing. With all of these, we have to eventually develop or transform. So eventually we're going to have to take the baby off the bottle or off the breast, right? So Freud said, and I'm going to skip to the bottom of the slide, that if you force a child to develop too fast, or you don't help them go through the stages at all, and they're delayed, it's possible that they could develop a fixation. So fixation is unfinished business from an earlier stage of development that affects you at a later point in time. So, what would an oral fixation look like? That might be a person who chews their nails, bites their nails, chews on straws, a person verbally who's verbally aggressive or sarcastic. That would be an oral fixation. Eating disorders would be an oral fixation. Substance use disorders would be linked to an oral fixation, according to Freud. Now, I know what you're thinking. Well, people abuse drugs and alcohol many different ways, not just an oral route of administration. My response is, yeah, we have gotten pretty creative, but the earliest way that people ingested things were orally, right? So all of these would be linked to an oral fixation, according to Freud. Okay, fine. Let's imagine that you weaned the child properly, you went through the oral stage of development properly. The next stage is the anal stage. And the anal stage goes from 18 months to 36 months, so roughly a year and a half to 3 years. And ultimately, the primary issue here is potty training. Now, going to the bathroom is a pleasure, right? So when you think about it, imagine that you had to go to the bathroom, but you're on a road, on a highway, and you're waiting 20, 30 minutes to get to a rest stop. When you finally get to a rest stop, there is some level of pleasure or relief that comes from going to the bathroom. So Freud understood this, and he said, well, this pleasure, the goal is potty training, and a parent's major job or the crisis is to effectively potty train. So if you force a kid into potty training too early, or you don't potty train at all, you're going to develop an anal fixation. So if you've ever heard or even used the term anal retentive, well, that actually comes from Freud. A person who is anal or anal retentive, they're a little bit OCD like, they're perfectionistic, things have to be a certain way. So Freud would say that perfectionistic or even OCD like tendency comes from an anal fixation. So you were forced into potty training too early and you held on to that fecal matter. Retention means to retain or to hold on to. So instead of potty training, you fought it and you held on to it. But the other scenario is also possible. The anal expulsive subtype is where you just let everything hang out, right? Or you just go to the bathroom, right? So certainly when a person has encopresis, which is going to bathroom on oneself, fecal matter that is, that would be an anal fixation. But in addition, anal expulsive could look like being exceedingly disorganized or messy, ADHD, things like that could be linked to an anal fixation, according to Freud. Now, I will tell you that Freud's theory of personality or psychosexual stages tend to be sexist and heterosexist. So, operating based on the general beliefs of his day, he talks about homosexuality as being an anal fixation, right? So if you think of homosexuality, he referred to that as an anal fixation. So that's the heterosexist nature of the theory. But I also said it's sexist as well, right? So the phallic stage, which occurs between 3 to 6 or your preschool years, this is when a person recognizes their genitals and has basic gender identification. And it is true. Research does suggest that people have some rudimentary understanding of their gender at around 3 years old. Here's where Freud goes wrong. Freud says that there are two phenomena that happen, and males and females react differently to discovering their genitals. Males are super excited and happy, and females tend to be a little bit more unhappy. And I'm going to quote Freud. He said, "Woe is me, for I lack that wondrous organ." That is what Freud believed women say. So for women, Freud believed they developed something called penis envy. There is some basic level of jealousy that women have towards men. On a basic level, from Freud, it's because males have a penis. And obviously, we have debunked his belief in penis envy, but there are some things that Freud would have used as an argument, right? So females have reported there are times where I say, I wish I was a guy right now. Anytime you use that phrase, Freud would say, see, that's penis envy at work, right? So if you're waiting in a long line for a bathroom and you're like, I wish I could just go in the men's room, Freud would say penis envy. During the menstrual cycle, Freud would say the fact that you have a menstrual cycle, there might be some implicit jealousy of men because they don't have it. You might say, I wish I didn't have this. Childbirth, the pain that's associated with childbirth. So there are these examples that Freud would say are symbolic of penis envy. But we've debunked it because based on modern understanding, we don't think it's that you want to be a guy or you're mourning the fact that you don't have a penis. You're just acknowledging that there are unique struggles of being a woman. So that would be how we respond to it. Now, Freud said, don't worry, you resolve this crisis by capturing a penis, right? So women, again, here's another heterosexist piece. He assumed that women would capture a penis through marriage and that would complete them, ignoring the fact that there are some women who are lesbian, right? So there's a heterosexist piece there. And the general assumption of male superiority, that myth is embedded there, right? Because there's this idea that women are somehow distraught that they're not men, right? So that is a sexist piece of his theory as well. Now, that's the major thing that happens with women during the phallic stage, the issue of penis envy. For males, he talks about this concept called the Oedipus complex. The Oedipus complex comes from mythology of Oedipus Rex, where Oedipus lusted after his mother, killed off his father, and was with his mother. Right now, in the story, he didn't know it was his mother, right? But the principle that young boys have some kind of, sexual attraction or desire to their mothers. That's the Oedipus complex. And it happens during the preschool years, right? So now Freud, here's a little bit more of the backstory of Freud. Freud was viewed as the golden child in his home. He was given preferential treatment as a child. His father was very stern and rigid, and his mother was warm and very loving. So Freud had a very, very strong bond to his mother. So, and a fear of his father. So it makes sense based on his own lived experience that he came up with this theory. Now, ultimately, Freud says, keep in mind, this is during the phallic stage. This is when you recognize your genitals. and you recognize it can be a source of pleasure. So you have this desire for mom based on the Oedipus complex, but you're not going to act on it. Why? Because boys develop in general, a sense of castration anxiety, the fear that if they act upon their Oedipal impulses, they're going to be castrated. So as a result, boys don't act on these sexual desires. And instead, what do? They do identification, which is they emulate their fathers in hopes that they could develop a relationship similar to their mother, right? So, and that's kind of, if you've ever heard people say, oh, it seems like I'm dating my father. Oh, it seems like I'm dating my mother. That piece, comes from this carryover of the Oedipus theory. Now, that's during the phallic stage. I will say that there is a parallel to the Oedipus complex called the Electra complex, which is the reverse, where young girls have some level of attraction to their father, and their mom serves as a rival, and a similar reconciliation happens through identification. Now, it's interesting, right? We even have terms like a mama's boy and daddy's little girl, right? These kind of phrases, kind of linking in a non-erotic way some of these Oedipal ideas. Okay, but during grade school, you go through a period of time where your sexual energy is latent or dormant. So in grade school, from 6 to about puberty, there's no real major sex drive or urges happening. So, yeah, you just live your life, and you're good. Then puberty hits. And at that point, all of that sexual energy comes back full force, right? And Freud says, by puberty, you're capable of mature sexual relationships. Now, the word mature, if we go back to developmental psychology, it doesn't mean he was encouraging teenage sex or 12-year-olds and 13-year-olds to have sex. That wasn't what he was saying. What he was saying was the word maturation is a biological development. And from a biological point of view, if you have sex, you have the potential for procreation, right? So from puberty onward, we have that sperm production and ovulation. So that's what he meant, mature sexual relationships. All right. So that is his psychosexual stages. As I said, this is a point of contention today. There are a lot of things in this that we push back against. And even some of Freud's followers will push back on how much he focuses on sex and how much he focuses on the male experience. The last thing I want to talk before I give you your break is this concept of defense mechanisms. So I said to you that the ego serves two functions, right? I said one is to satisfy the desires of the id without compromising the values of the superego. But another major function of the ego is to help us cope with anxiety. And defense mechanisms help us deal with anxiety. So let's take one like denial. So denial is more than just a river in Egypt. I'm sure you've heard that corny joke. But denial is the rejection of the reality of something, no matter what. So an example of denial could be a student getting a bad grade on a report card saying, grades don't matter, right? Well, saying, grades don't matter, that's your way of denying the fact that you did poorly on the test, right? Or there must be a mistake. Maybe the teacher made a mistake. That would be another uh, example of denial. Or if a person is diagnosed with cancer, they might say, I want a second opinion, rejecting the reality of the first opinion. And most second opinions confirm the first, right? So that idea of denial is like, no, it can't be, right? Reaction formation. Reaction formation is a process where we're feeling one thing and then we act to the exact opposite. And let's imagine you had a neighbor that you don't like. So if you don't like your neighbor, what do? You avoid them, right? So you avoid them, and but one day you're opening your door and you lock eyes. Now you know you're going to have a conversation with them, right? Because the social rules. So what do? You pretend. You say, oh, it's so good to see you. Where have you been? It's been such a long time. Mind you, you've been avoiding them, right? But you're saying the opposite. Now, why don't you say to them directly, I don't like you. I've been avoiding you and I don't want to talk to you, right? The reason why we don't do that is that would be distressing, right? That would cause anxiety. That would be perceived as rude. So instead of being perceived as rude, we pretend and we project the exact opposite onto it, onto what we're experiencing. Displacement. Displacement is another one where uh, you have some kind of anger or frustration. Instead of dealing with the frustration directly, you redirect that anger towards a more safer target. An example might be, let's say you were at work and you got into a fight with your boss. You're not going to um, just lash out at them. You need the job. So what do? When you come home, you pick a fight with your romantic partner or your parents or your siblings, or you're a little bit more grumpy with your children, right? These examples are displacement. Now, why is it that you take all that frustration you have with your boss and put it on your parents, spouse, children, and so forth, siblings? The answer is you have more equity with them. You have a well-established relationship. So it's a safer place to discharge that frustration or anxiety. So that it happens all the time. Repression. Repression and suppression. We talked about this in the cognitive lecture. Repression is the process, and this is more of an unconscious experience where you black out or you just push it out of your memory. So, but you're not saying I want to push it out. It just happens because there's so much stress or pain involved with that memory that you just do it. Versus suppression, which is a conscious or willful act. And I'll give you an example. The best example I could give is, and this should happen to no one, or I hope it would never happen to anyone, certainly in here. But imagine you're running in Central Park and you experience some kind of physical or sexual trauma, right? There are two kinds of experiences people have. One experience is the person blacks out and they don't remember details of the event. That is what we call repression. So they can't consciously recall it. They didn't say, I don't want to think about this. It just happened. Versus suppression, the person might remember all of the details in an extreme painful way that they say, you know what? I don't want to deal with this right now. So what are you going to do? Are you going to report it? Are you going to go to the police? Are you going to do this? Friends might say that. The person might say, I just don't want to think about it right now. Well, that process is different, right? That's more of a suppression because you're consciously pushing that information out of your forethought. All right. So we also have regression. There are times when people revert to a more childlike state when they're anxious. So have you ever seen people get super goofy or silly when they're stressed? That would be regression. Intellectualization is trying to rationalize on a high level, but separating oneself from the experience, right? So intellectualization is a willful removal of oneself on a cognitive level, whereas rationalization is just justifying your behavior, right? So let's say a person was struggling with alcohol abuse and they're out with their friends, and the friend says, "Hey, let's have a drink, let's celebrate." And then the person says, "Well, okay, I don't want to be rude," or, "Well, I just want to be social. Um, I don't want to offend them," all kinds of things like that. They're all rationalization. Because if you struggle with an alcohol use disorder, then that drink is going to set you back, and it isn't going to be one drink, it's going to be many. Compensation is where a person feels stress or anxiety or inadequacy in one area, so they redirect that in another area. So let's say they're bad at reading, so they overcompensate to show how good they are at math or something like that. Or if you have a child, right? And you have an older child who's feeling like they're getting lost because there's a younger child who's getting all the attention, right? That person may clown around or whatever it might be. And sublimation is to redirect these base desires to more acceptable impulses. So the concept of defense mechanisms, as I said, Freud said a lot of really good things. I believe, and what we found is that we use all of these. And if I were to ask you in the room, do you use any of these defense mechanisms? I would bet the vast majority of you would raise your hand and you would say, yeah, I do use this one. I do use that one, because it's how we cope with anxiety. So here is just a cartoon picture of some of the defense mechanisms. I'm not going to go through all of them, but anxiety is kind of like an invading army. And your ego, one of its jobs is to help you deal with anxiety and cope. So let's take rationalization. This person is pouring hot oil on the invading army. And how do they justify pouring hot oil knowing they're going to burn someone? They say to themselves, "Excuse us, fellas, we're just cleaning out the kitchen." Right. That's a rationalization. Or reaction formation, doing the opposite. You have the invading army shooting arrows at you and you're throwing back roses, right? And displacement, instead of fighting the invading army, you start attacking one another. So these are just a few examples. I'm going to stop there and I'm going to give you your break and we'll go from there.